income for your agency is earned, per hour. And again, this is one of these key ideas is like in a service-based business, that is how you are making money. You are somehow building an inventory of capacity to sell to the market. That's fundamentally every service-based business. That is what you are doing. And again, the exact way in terms of like how you bucket these different buckets of income, it's all ultimately being driven by the time that you're spending on the work.
Welcome to the Agency Profit Podcast, a show dedicated to going deep space on agency operations, which is just as nerdy as it sounds. I'm your host, Marcel Petitpas. I'm the CEO of Parakeeto, a firm that helps digital and creative agencies measure and improve their profitability. Join me as I interview some of the smartest thought leaders and agency owners in our space and go deep into operations, metrics, and all the other things you need to get right so you can spend less time worrying about operations and more time executing on your vision. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Agency Profit Podcast. I always say I'm excited for today's episode, but I'm especially excited about today's episode because someone very important to me, but also to all of you, you just don't know it yet, is joining us on the show today. He is my business partner, co-founder here at Parakeeto, and really the brains behind this entire operation, and has been working in the background, not in the public eye on the podcast like me, for example, but really building a lot of the technology and driving a lot of the philosophy, the ways of thinking that have been fundamental to Parakeeto over all of these years. So with all of that, Ben Zittlau, thank you for joining us on the show today, man.
Yeah, happy to be here.
I appreciate the enthusiasm. For everyone that doesn't know who you are, I'd love to start with just a little bit of your very impressive background. How did you come to become a part of Parakeeto? And just a little bit of context for everyone listening on what you've accomplished.
Yeah. I'll try and do a decent kind of in a nutshell description of the journey. So I originally studied electrical engineering, and I started in kind of that industry back in 2008, 2009, but got interested in startups and entrepreneurship right around that time. And it was a really exciting time in the startup world because the App Store had just released. Android actually hadn't come out yet, but was soon to come out. SaaS was very much in its infancy. Paying for things on the internet were very much in their infancy. So there's this real, greenfield, blue sky, open opportunity that was kind of opening up at the time. So I got really interested in that, and basically started trying to do web-based startups, and took a few swings at that over the early years, and ran this playbook of save up some money, try and start something, run through my runway, however long I had, and generally see it fail, but kind of learn each time around, and was running that for a number of years. And then back around, I guess it'd be like 2000, I want to say 2012, either 2011, 2012, did my first startup that actually got some funding. So it was a startup called mover.io, and made a run at that. And there's a whole story behind that one, but we managed to, again, go out and raise some money, build a team there. Had some issues with my business partner, so I ended up walking away from that. But eventually that actually ended up selling to Microsoft. So it's kind of like the first swing that actually connected and didn't fade away into the darkness, but actually turned into something. And then moving on from that, I ended up working with a company here in town where I live in Edmonton called Jobber, and I came in as one of the early employees. I was number maybe 13 or 14. I was the first member of the leadership team and first manager that wasn't one of the two founders there. And I stuck around from there. I was originally running the product team, and then I moved into the lead technical role. And then finally, the last year I was there, I started and ran the growth team for that company. So that was about a 5-year journey. And while I was there, that company grew from, again, about 13 or 14. I think when I left, it was about 135. And then today, they're 800 plus, on their path to kind of unicorn status. So there's quite a journey, and they're continuing to kill it and grow. But after 5 years, I was ready for something new. So I took a step back and I was working with other just companies as a consultant, helping them in the early stages of getting their technical stacks figured out, their teams figured out. And one of the things when I was working at Jobber is Jobber also actually worked with service businesses, but home service businesses. And one of the things that we heard a lot from our customers was a significant change in their success trajectory when they started learning important ideas like the difference between revenue and profitability. So instead of just chasing large dollar figure projects, which would often actually end up leaving them, sometimes in the red in terms of the overall profit of the project, to be able to track those things, differentiate them, and really think differently about the profitability and success of their businesses. But it's hard, and we tried at Jobber a few times. We looked at trying to build that stuff into the platform, but it was just really tricky. There's a lot of variance between different companies, between different industries. So we ended up never really being able to successfully execute that. But I always loved that lens. And it's something that I really dug deeply into on growth for Jobber as a company was how do we actually model out this business, and be able to think of it in terms of abstractions and, be able to play around with thought experiments about like, if we move this lever, what impact would it have for the business as a whole? So anyways, then doing my contract work, got connected with Marcel and this thing called Parakeeto when it was in an earlier age and a slightly different looking company at the time, but still really focused on this idea of the service-based businesses and the importance, in particular, small businesses, and the importance of being able to get this kind of modeling and visibility and how hard it was to do. And not only how hard it was to do, but conceptually, how common it was to be kind of thinking about businesses in a way that wasn't actually effective for this type of service business, and working through all the ideas about how to do that in a more useful way, as well as, of course, trying to figure out how to actually take product, services, technology to market to try and help companies achieve those things. And so that stuff was all really interesting to me. And Marcel and I connected on that, and decided after a little bit of a trial period to try and take this on together. And again, that was, I think, maybe 6 years ago, 5 years ago now, long time ago. And we're still here.
We're still here. So I'm really excited about this episode, of course, but about the fact that we're going to get a chance to do this hopefully many more times over the next little while, because what I don't think people understand is that I go out and I'm the show pony. I do a lot of presenting of our ideas to the market. And we talk about the metrics and the formulas for those metrics, the relationship between those metrics. But what people, of course, have not seen is that that polished presentation of those ideas is the result of you and I having spent hours and hours and hours and hours thinking through all these edge cases, trying these things with agencies, learning what works, learning what doesn't work, and having to kind of wade through this incredibly complex problem, which is how do you look at a business in a way that is effective, truthful, consistent, all of those things. And so I think it'll be really cool for people to see inside what those conversations look like between the two of us, and the perspective that you bring to those, especially, which is quite different than my perspective a lot of the time. And I think that's why we end up at such good conclusions.
Yeah, it's something that's been really valuable on kind of our journey together is that complementary dynamic between our strengths. And the work that we've done behind the scenes to really battle test all these ideas. And I'm really proud of the depth of thinking that's gone into the conceptual framework and the metrics and how we can think about them, and how to deal with all the different variants that's out there in the world. And I imagine we'll probably get into that a little bit more in this conversation. But I think it's one thing that really sets us apart from a lot of the other frameworks is that ultimately we really try to connect to the foundational key concepts that are going to be true for any business, and then figure out how to connect that to each individual business, where I think a lot of the other kind of competing thought frameworks out there are a lot more rigid, so often might not fit, be able to fit specific context of the different businesses. And again, so much of that is because of a lot of seeing a lot of companies, and of course a lot of whiteboarding and debating and working through to close those gaps and develop our ideas. And it's come a long ways. Like the key ideas, and that's one of the things that's really neat, is the really key ideas behind it all have remained the same, but there's so much that's been filled in terms of the details and the nuance.
So with all of that, I want to frame up the topic for today, which is really about this trap that is so easy to fall into, and we see people fall into it all the time. And as entrepreneurs ourselves, we are constantly reminded what it feels like to be enticed by these lenses and frameworks for looking at your business that are designed to serve a different purpose often than what we're trying to accomplish. But we can fall into this trap of trying to use it to do the job that we're doing every day, which is making decisions about what do we do next? And should we make investments here? Should we hire people? Should we fire people? How are we performing? And the most common example of that would be, for example, using cash versus accrual-based accounting to make an assessment of the business. But there's lots of other examples of these lenses that are designed for one purpose, but often get used to manage the business. And they lead us to either the wrong conclusions or sometimes false positives, false negatives, a level of confidence about the business, but that is not actually reflective of reality. And so this is the thing that I think we want to talk about today is what are those traps, how to think about that, how to avoid that trap. So let's start there. Let's unpack the problem. What is it? What are some other examples, and where does that come from?
Yeah. So cash flow is a great example. Cash flow is, of course, an important thing to monitor and to manage. Ultimately, a business needs to be able to pay its bills, hit payroll. The cash needs to be there at the right time in order to achieve those things, and if it isn't, there can be significant consequences for that. And I think there's certainly is a really early stage business, cash flow is the easiest mental frame to fall into. It's you look at your bank account, how much cash is there? And then all the other questions about, how much is outstanding? Is this customer going to pay? When are they going to pay? How much work do I have? Maybe just kind of keeping kind of like a mental log in the back of your head. And when do I need to pay payroll? How much is that payroll going to be? When is the license for the software coming due? So that's kind of where you can start is cash flow. And, for a really simple business, it's not the worst way to look at a business. But underneath that, there's these fundamental questions where it's okay, you're looking at this cash lens. But over time, is that cash balance going to grow, or is that cash balance going to decline? Are you going to be adding more, to that bank account over time or not? And in the thick of it, again, when you're trying to balance all these different considerations in your head, it's basically impossible to know. Probably the best that you get is at the end of a quarter or a year, your accountant, is going to do up your books and tell you what happened over that time period. But you don't kind of fundamentally know, in terms of the actual design of your business, in terms of what you're selling, in terms of how much you're selling it for. Is it actually setting you up for success, or is it setting up for failure? And again, from that cash lens kind of standpoint, you're looking at transactions in your bank account or something and trying to walk back to that, it's kind of fundamentally not, I would say, not possible. There's too much context that's missing from that perspective to actually get to those answers. So I think that's one of the biggest challenges. And yeah, in the accounting lens, there's that cash-based accounting, and then there's accrual-based accounting. And we could talk about accrual-based accounting and some of the challenges there. Accrual certainly gets closer, but it definitely is some challenges there as well.
A couple of recent examples, two clients that had the same challenge of a predominantly cash-based lens on their business, driving a lot of decision-making, but two very different outcomes. So the first was a client that we had. They had two main types of services that they sold. One was to very large companies, and it was a direct to that company sale, but the payment terms were net 90. So that was actually, when we did the analysis, a much more profitable service, but the cash flow was much more challenging because they'd often go 90 or 120 days without getting paid. And then they had another service where they were subcontracted. So they got paid a lot quicker, but the profitability was a lot lower. But they ended up taking on much more of this subcontracted work because they had cash flow issues, and they started to conflate the better cash flow of that other service with it being more profitable. And so it created, again, this kind of false positive of saying, oh, we need to take on more of this work because it's more profitable, when in reality it was less profitable, the cash flow was better. And so it was a trap that kind of led them to a really bad place where now they were even more dependent on that short-term cash because their profitability was actually not that good and there was no cash reserve being built up.
Yeah. And the reality is, designing and finding a business model that is highly profitable, just structurally independent of cash flow, is really hard. Whereas there are ways that you can solve the cash flow problem. Like if there's a significant improvement in profitability, it's just a cash flow issue. Of course, you can actually go to market, debt, get cost some money, borrow some money for some period of time. You can retain earnings. There's ways that you can solve the cash flow problem, if that's what the challenge is. If like, I've got this business model that I can trust in a lot. Now, of course, there's other elements where, like, sometimes there's like the cash flow delays, like we're talking about there, and then there's also increased risk. So having a net 90 is less problematic if it's a contract with like an enterprise customer that that's going to pay. In other words, if you're going out and you're giving like net 90 terms to like small, potentially less stable customers, where you might have a lot greater risk of a bad debt, then that changes things a little bit. And then sometimes getting paid up front or getting paid sooner can also have impacts on the reliability of that revenue stream. But just in terms of the timing can be solved in other ways. And you can end up with a much better business if you can separate those things.
Yeah. And that's exactly where that conversation with that client ended up leading, was this realization of, oh, hey, actually the more profitable service is this thing. So let's talk about the question of cash flow independently, right? And the two sides of that being, okay, well, how much expense do you need to carry? How much labor costs do you need to incur? Can you change payment terms with some of your contractors and vendors so that you're insulating yourself? Can you retain more earnings? Is there factoring? What are the options that you have to try and reduce the impact that this cash flow is having, so that you can actually sell more of that thing, which on the balance ended up being a better thing for them. And then there's a second example I want to talk to here, because it's the similar trap of focusing on cash and getting to the wrong outcome, but it's a different one in that it was a client that did their first year in business, $800,000 in revenue, right? So by all objective measures, wildly successful first year in business for them. And because they were closing so much business so consistently that first year and getting these big deposit checks up front, they had the illusion of profitability because they had so much cash flow. And then they hit a drought on their sales towards the end of that year and came to a point where they still had a bunch of work to do, but there was no more money. The bank account was empty, but the projects weren't done. And so it was in that moment that they recognized, oh, we actually fundamentally aren't profitable. But again, because of the lens they were applying to the business, they were blind to that until
they kind of like effectively took pre-sales, but weren't recognizing that they had already sold their capacity, and already been paid for it. And of course, if you already sell it, then you can't sell it twice.
Yeah. So, I mean, I'm not going to use the word Ponzi scheme, but, similar in terms of the mechanics, where it's kind of like you're using the money from the next client to kind of pay for the work on the last client that is still underwater.
Yeah. The way, Ponzi scheme is a little bit aggressive. More the way I think about that is that feeling when you're like running backwards and you just like, you have to keep running to just like keep your feet under you, and you just constantly feel like you're going to fall. And of course, at some point, if you can't keep that speed up, you are, you're going to fall on your ass.
So we've talked about cash flow as kind of one of the main lenses that creates a trap. What are some examples of, maybe other lenses that you see commonly apply to business that can lead to negative outcomes?
One of our favorite ones, I don't know. Well, anyways, one of the ones that we have to work through with a lot of our customers, and is also related to the kind of cash flow lens, is what we call revenue versus AGI. in our terminology. And what we mean by that is, cash that comes in the door that you bring in with your left hand, you immediately pass out with your right hand to a vendor. So great examples of this are something like your marketing agency, and you do the strategic work, the creative work, and then you hand it off to production company to do the production. So, in the contract for the customer, maybe it's a 300K contract and 200K of that is production that you're just subbing out. And the trick is like, is that, how do you think about that money that's coming in for the subbed out work? And there's some great examples of this where it's like you think about a company like Airbnb, where people are booking these stays through Airbnb. And, I don't know what their numbers are these days, but, they keep like 5% or 10% of each transaction, and the rest gets passed through to the actual owner of the rental unit. So it's like, which number is Airbnb's revenue? Is it, every dollar that flows through them, even though 90% of it is actually just, passing through to someone else, or is it the top figure? And the problem with the top figure is that money might as well have not ever passing your door. In turn, like fundamentally, when you think about the business, it's like if in the Airbnb, when you fill out the Airbnb payment form, if 10% went into Airbnb's account and 90% went directly into the rental owner's account, fundamentally it's still the same business. Like Airbnb still has the same overheads, they need to run the same technology, they're offering the same features. It's this like very tactical change to say like, oh, instead of this just like passing straight through our bank account and out the other door, we're just going to like actually give it directly to them. So it's like the same thing. You think about these production fees. Well, like what if everything was the same? The contract that you give to the customers for the same dollar amount, but they wrote two checks, one to you and one that went directly to the production company. The services you're offering are the same. Your sales process was the same. Your marketing is the same. The customer's the same. Everything's the same. It's this very small tactical change. And then like all of a sudden, like you're viewing like, oh, my company is now a third of the size that it was before because we're doing a third of the revenue. It's like, it's just, it's a false sense of scale. And like, certainly we've seen that with customers where they come in, they're like, oh, we're a $10 million business. And then we look at it and $9 million is what's, coming in again, one door and then immediately going out the other door. So it's like, well, at the end of the day, you have $1 million to actually run your business with. You have $1 million to pay your staff, to cover your overhead, to try and extract some profit. So if you're thinking of yourself as a $10 million business and benchmarking your scale and your spend and your overhead and your offices, you're setting yourself up for failure, because that's not actually what the true scale of your business is. And then it can also lead to things where when you're comparing different ways to structure your business, different service lines that you offer, how do you compare those two things together? So maybe a service where you're not subbing anything out, versus one where you are bringing this 200K, it makes everything way more confusing. So it's so important to take, that slice that we call pass through, and to take it off of that revenue, and then only focus on, what is left in your bank account, what is actually the money that comes in to fund your agency itself. And again, if you're looking at it from a cash flow, it's like, oh, we had this amazing month. We brought in, 600K worth of cash this month. And it's like, well, yeah, but 500K, that wasn't yours. You were just holding it for someone else.
Do you want some free resources to help you measure and improve your profitability? If you do, then I want to tell you about our agency profitability toolkit, which you can grab absolutely free in the show notes or by heading to parakeeto.com/toolkit. It's packed with training videos, cheat sheets, templates, and all kinds of other great resources to help you start measuring and improving the essential metrics that are going to drive better profitability in your business. And it's helped thousands of other agencies around the world do the same. So I want to encourage you to go and grab a copy of that. And if you'd rather get in the fast lane and just have our team of experts guide you through the process of measuring and improving your profitability, then I want to encourage you to apply for a consultation at parakeeto.com. And with that, I want to thank you again for tuning in. I hope you enjoy the episode, and I'll let you get back to it. So we had a recent example of this. We were working with a client that had a significant amount of pass through in their organization. And when they came to us and started working with us, they did not have this necessarily this clarity in terms of how to think about the components of a client contract how much of that was their money, how much of it. And we saw this play out in that once we kind of got everything sorted and we looked at their agency, their payroll was almost double the actual amount of revenue that belonged to them after isolating pass through, right? So this is an example of a business that, because they didn't have a lens that was showing them, a more truthful representation of their business and the ratios within that business, they ended up kind of very lopsided in their design and their decision making as a result. And now there's a lot of work to be done to try and right size that and clean it up. And one of the things that came up in that, and that we've kind of been working through helping them reframe, is this idea of markup. Because I think this is one of the traps within the trap that people fall into, right? We've had quite a few discussions about this as of late, which is, oh, well, we're collecting all this money, but what about the markup? And treating that as being different or separate from the amount of money that is being applied to the time or the direct services. And I think this gets into this conflation of how something is presented to a client in terms of pricing, in terms of a contract, in terms of a scope of work, versus how it's represented internally when it comes down to just the brass tacks of what is the math on this client engagement.
Yeah. It's again, one thing that I really love about how we look at a business. And again, is I think distinct from a lot of other lenses, is we take a very operational lens on the business. That's where our focus is. So similarly, like cash flow, it's like, well, manage your cash flow, make sure that's taken care of. If you need to go, take on some debt, short-term debt to manage cash flow, whatever, go do that. But we don't really care how you're doing that. Like who you go get that debt from, what the cost of it is. What we focus on is the actual core of your business and, the profitability of it. And similarly here, it's like sales, is not the thing that we're focused on. So of course, sales are important. You have to be selling. But, when you put together a sales proposal to a customer, how you're breaking that down to get the best outcome, to get the best buy from a customer, whether that's in terms of an hourly rate or package. And of course, we have some opinions on that stuff that we can talk about. But whether it's an hourly rate, whether it's like, packaged, whether you're listing as markup, in terms of the key analysis, the key metrics that we look at are our modeling. What really matters, again, is how much cash is going to end up in your bank account for having done this work. And in some ways it, should be pretty obvious that you have a contract and you give a proposal to a customer that, gives, $20,000 worth of services and $10,000 worth of markup, or you give them that exact same proposal, but it has it blended as 30,000 of markup or zero markup and 30,000 of services. At the end of the day, you're delivering the exact same work for having the same amount of cash ending up in your bank account. And like, that's what we're really focused on, is like however it is effective to frame it to the customer. Maybe it's more palatable for them to think about that 10K being markup. They think that like, oh, if you're only spending 20 hours on this and that hourly rate's obscene, or whatever. So it's a useful tactic in terms of getting the customer buy-in, optimizing the income you're able to generate for doing the work to put it on a proposal in that way. But where people get messed up is when they start like viewing them as these distinct buckets. Like, oh, here's this work that we did that we got paid for. And like, oh, here's this free 10K that we got for markup. And, not understanding the kind of the relationship between those things, where in most cases, that markup is actually still part of what you're being paid for having done the work. If you could go to market and spend zero time on things and just get, 10% markup for doing no work, that's an amazing business model. Like, to get paid to do nothing, that's great. And if there's a scalable business model that you found that allows you to do that and not do the actual services work yourself, lean into that, because that's amazing. But in almost all cases, it's actually just income you are being paid for the work that you do, for the services, for the time of your staff. It's just, broken out differently on a proposal to a customer for generally more sales reasons or just conventional reasons. And yeah, that's a challenging mental shift for a lot of people to go through.
It's amazing how ingrained that is. I'll talk about a couple of other nuances to the thinking that I think trips people up around that. First, I want to talk about how we solve for that in our framework, right? So our whole lens is that anything that you sell basically boils down to two, maybe three elements. So if we're thinking about delivery margin, it's how much agency gross income does this represent? So that's a function of, or you get a check from a client, you pull out the pass-through expenses, whatever's left is agency gross income. So if you're applying markup, that all just becomes agency gross income. So like how much money is left after you pay for the external pass-through expenses. And then the other side of that equation is delivery cost. What will it cost us to get this done? And that's generally a function of how many hours multiplied by the average cost per hour of that labor. If we were looking at average billable rate, it's just agency gross income divided by hours. And so, one of the examples we saw recently with this client was this being caught up in this idea of like, oh, but our rate is 150 an hour. It's like, that's fine that that's your rate on your rate card, but the average billable rate of this engagement is agency gross income divided by the number of hours it takes you to earn it. That's it. So if you have a bunch of markup and it's raising your average billable rate, that is true. That's a reality. And that's an important thing for us to see, because wouldn't you want to know that you make way more money on this service, that you get a whole bunch of markup that you get to earn in a small amount of time? I mean, that's an important insight to understand. And so functionally, by simplifying everything down to these very simple, fairly compound elements, we actually level the playing field, which allows us to look objectively at all of these different combinations. And we see with clients, they'll have dozens of different combinations of pricing and scoping and packaging, but this puts them all on a level playing field so we can really compare them apples to apples.
Yeah, because otherwise, so yeah, you have like your rate card. This is our rate, and again, maybe there's a sense that there's a certain rate that's palatable to customers. Like, oh, customers wouldn't pay more than $100 an hour, $200 an hour for this service. So that's like what a rate card is. And then the markups is beside that. And like, oh, I can't tell my customers I'm earning $260 per hour because they'd be upset. It's like, well, that's fine. Again, like whatever you tell your customer is fine. But what we care about is how much revenue did your agency earn for each hour of work. And that's clearly incorporates both whatever you charge them for, per hour, and then also, any other sources of revenue. Like markup's the main one, but there can be other ways in which revenue is brought in to your company. It could be like through partnerships or things like that, where by doing this engagement, additional funds are brought in, and then you can look at things like, should I be scaling up my team? And you can look at that in terms of how much your agency earns for each hour that a certain role within your company does. Where if you're neglecting that markup, you're not looking at the actual true net amount earned for each hour that someone works. And then I've seen these extreme examples where sometimes like we see this in SaaS all the time, where there's a sense that like, oh, product coaching is free. Like, oh, they pay for the subscription and then product coaching is free. And of course, that's problematic because things like if you try and scale up your business 10x, you got to scale up your coaching, right? So not being able to link back your revenue to how many, again, hours, how much of your team's capacity is needed to actually deliver on these things. And again, these pure markup worlds where it's like, oh, we have these like services we give away for free. Like one example I give is someone I know where they work at a custom homes company, and they do the project management and architecture work, quote unquote, for free, right? They don't bill the customer for it. But and because of that, they don't track it. They're like, oh, well, this isn't, we're not billing our customers. Well, why would we track it? It's like, well, because you have no idea, you have no idea how much you're making, per hour of your team's time, how much you need to scale up the team, whether it's going to be profitable to scale up the team, again, because you're not, recognizing that income for your agency is earned, per hour. And again, this is one of these key ideas is like in a service-based business, that is how you are making money. You are somehow building an inventory of capacity to sell to the market. And then you do that. You package, in some way you take the hours that you have available to sell and you sell to customers, and that brings income into your agency. That's fundamentally every service-based business. That is what you are doing. And again, the exact way in terms of like how you bucket these different buckets of income, it's all ultimately being driven by the time that you're spending on the work.
Hmm. So this leads to a couple of other details that I want to just double click on, because we're getting into the weeds on this issue, which is two other kind of subcomponents of this trap. One, which is letting the way that something is packaged to the client dictate how it is structured in the data schema internally within the company, right? And so, we see all kinds of examples of this where you have a client, you sell them something, it's packaged a certain way, it's value priced, or it's based on percent of ad spend or whatever. And then you end up with all of these, or you have a different service over here that's sold hourly, you have a different service over here that's sold as like a flat fee project. And you end up with all these slightly idiosyncratic structures of data, ways of thinking about and calculating margin, ways of thinking about and calculating average billable rates. And now you can't actually compare these things to each other. That's a huge trap. And then related to that is it kind of comes back to the cash versus accrual, where you start to model the way that you earn revenue based on the way that it was packaged and sold to a client, as opposed to how you actually earn the revenue. So we've seen lots of examples of this as well, where it's like you sell something. So let's say, for example, you're selling somebody a retainer, but they pay for 12 months up front and you get them to sign an annual agreement. So they think, oh, well, this is a 12-month agreement. We're going to put it in as a project and it's going to get earned over this period of time. When the reality is, well, no, this is actually a monthly recurring scope of work. It's the same each month. So like the way we model this in terms of how we earn the revenue, in terms of how we plan the capacity, in terms of like, that's fundamentally different. And it is disconnected. It should be disconnected from how we've packaged that and sold it to the client and represented this to the client, which is somewhat arbitrary, to be honest.
Another one that I love is, say, defects. So you're building a website, right? And it's like, oh, they paid us, again, $100 hourly rate, 200 hours, 20K project. And that was our billable rate. Our billable rate was $100 per hour, but we warranty it. And then we end up fixing defects afterwards, but we don't bill the customer for defects. So like our hourly rate is 100, but like, oh, I guess we did 50 hours of free work. And it's like, well, no, you did, 250 hours of paid work. It's just how it's framed, to the customers. It's not like these hours were paid for and these ones aren't. Like you need to look at the overall, usage of time, and it's so much more effective. But yeah, this because like, oh, but on the proposal we gave to a customer, we said these hours cost $100 and these hours are free. And it's like, well, that's again how you're structuring things to the customer. And again, it's so important to have the type of lens that we really focus on, which is the sales is going to want to structure things in a certain way in order to be as effective as they can at sales, which is what you want. And it's like operations is going to structure things in a certain way. The projects, the sequencing, the costs, and you want operations to that to be as effective as possible. Accounting is going to structure things in a certain way. And you don't want to go, oh, I need these all to, be hard linked to each other. My accounting lens and my sales lens and my operational lens all need to be exactly 100% the same lens. But that's often what happens. Is like kind of this like battle for like who's going to win out and force the entire company to work in terms of like their group's functional lens on things. And the trick is like for a small business that is hard to do. It's hard to think, how am I going to allow these different groups within my organization to focus on just like, using the tools, using the structures, the framings that are most effective for them, and then still cohesively try and tie everything, together. But the other way is actually like, I rarely see succeed, even if you try it, because who's trying to hold everyone? Who's making sure that like when your operations manager goes and adds a project into Jira, into Asana, that they're structuring it exactly the same as sales and exactly the same as accountant, and who's managing that compliance. It's really rare to have someone in an organization. Sometimes it's a founder that actually monitors that and keeps everyone in sync. But then like what happens when it makes sense to change how you're doing things operationally? you can't, because you'd have to change everything across the entire organization.
Well, and we've seen this play out, many, many, many times. And to me, this is one of the kind of fundamental problems with the idea of a professional services automation platform that tries to homogenize everything and link it all together within the workflow. And the reality is that, we've even seen this with something as simple as trying to connect time tracking and project management together in one platform. You end up having to make a bunch of compromises. And what you often end up with is a framework that does a poor job of everything, as opposed to several frameworks that all do a good job of the one thing they're supposed to do. And I think it's important. This is a great thing for us to end on, right? To keep in mind that, to your point, these different frameworks are being hired to do different jobs, right? So even let's just think within accounting, the cash lens is important for the cash flow needs to get done, and it has a specific purpose, and there are specific questions it's designed to answer. Just like the tax optimized books are hired to do a job, which is to minimize your taxable income. Those are going to look different than like the management accounting, which are going to be much more accrual, and their job is to tell you what's really happening in business and help you make decisions, which is different than your capacity forecast, which is different than your resource plan. And like all of these things are different. There's a specific job, and that job is linked to specific questions. And unfortunately, that is the nuance, is that these things are all going to be slightly different. And I would just encourage everyone to be very weary of and very critical of the idea of trying to take one of these lenses and apply it everywhere, and really stop to consider, what is the job that this person is doing with this? And is it the same as the job that I'm trying to do over here? Or is it the same question that I'm trying to answer? And often you'll find that it's not.
Yeah. And one of the hard pills to swallow when you accept that is you want to get insights about your business. So in this idea of like everything's going to be linked up perfectly, they're all going to be, like the accounting invoices relative to the sales proposals, relative to the project plans, everything's going to be perfectly aligned. So I can run a report and see, exactly where we are in terms of all those things. That when you accept it, though, that they're going to think slightly differently, be structured slightly differently, use slightly different terminology. The challenge is, how do you actually get high level insights, or do you just not? And again, I think that's something where, like in terms of the frameworks that we've created, the conceptual frameworks provide the structure that can allow that to happen. And then of course, like in terms of what we do for our customers, but also in terms of what we're seeing emerging with technology, this is going to be viable, with the work that we're doing and the work that's going to be happening in the space in general. We are completely convinced that this idea of reporting living inside of any one of these tools or happening in spreadsheets is going to be archaic. There are going to be, there's going to be technology, there's going to be platforms to manage this. How do I pull together, the data from these different places, structured different ways, and aggregate it in a way that actually, so gets you the key answers that you need to get at a higher level? That's coming. And there's going to be a time when it's going to be obvious that that's the way that things should be done.
And it's interesting because I think we have a lot of confidence in this, A, because we're working on it. We're very close to the problem. But B, because if you go up market to larger businesses, this stuff is already happening. It's just a question of trying to take those same methods and technologies and make them more accessible, simplify them, bring them down market. And that's really, I think, a lot of what we're doing here. So we know that it works because we've seen it work at a larger scale. And now the question is just, how do we make it easier and simpler and more cost effective? And those are the problems that we're trying to solve today at Parakeeto. Well, this has been a very interesting conversation. I'm sure everyone listening has enjoyed it. One shameless plug, we've talked a lot about our framework here today. I just want to remind you all that it is available to you at no cost within our Agency Profit Toolkit. You've probably already heard an advertisement for it. There's a link to it in the show notes. It's free. So if you want to start to get an understanding of what is this framework that they're talking about that helps you get these kinds of answers, you can start to dig into that at no cost. So encourage everyone to go check that out. With that, Ben, I had a lot of fun today. I hope we'll do more of these together. So thank you for making the time to be on the show.
Yeah, glad to do it. Glad to be here.
Hey, thanks so much for tuning in to today's episode. I hope you enjoyed it. And if you've ever found yourself thinking, man, I get so much value from this podcast, I wish there was something I could do to return the favor. Well, today's your lucky day because you can leave us a review wherever you're listening to this, and it is incredibly helpful. Of course, if you haven't grabbed a free copy of the Agency Profit Toolkit, go and get that. It's got tons of free resources to help you improve your profitability. If you're looking to get in the fast lane and get help from experts to improve your profitability and measure your most important metrics, then apply for a consultation at parakeeto.com. We'd love to chat with you and figure out how we can help. With all of that, thank you so much for being a listener, and we will see you on the next episode.